What if I told you there was a time when the most feared warriors in the world didn't just conquer your land? They conquered your body, your spirit, and even your place in the afterlife. The Viking raiders were not merely seafaring plunderers. They were masters of a form of psychological and physical domination, so complete that it blurred the line between sex violence and ritual. From humiliating enemies in ways that destroyed their honor forever to using intimacy as a weapon of war, their practices would shock even the most hardened historian. And as we journey into this dark chapter of human history, be prepared to face scenes that will challenge every assumption you've had about the so-called Age of the Vikings. If you dare to walk this path with me, hit that subscribe button now, because the truth we're about to uncover is not for the faint of heart. It begins in the year 922 AD on the frigid waterways of what is now Russia. A Muslim diplomat named Ahmed ibn Fadlan was sent north to meet a people he had only heard of in whispers, the Rus Viking traders and raiders whose reputation for brutality preceded them like the stench of a storm. He expected barbarism. What he witnessed, however, would haunt him for the rest of his life. In his own words recorded in painstaking detail, he described a ritual so intimate and violent that it reads today like the script of a horror film. But it was no fiction. Every detail, from the flickering torchlight to the screams in the night, was seared into the pages of his account. The scene that met Ibn Fadlan's eyes was a Viking funeral, but unlike any ceremony he had ever imagined. It was not a solemn gathering of mourners. It was a calculated performance of power, pleasure, and death, in which a young slave girl was chosen to join her dead master in the afterlife. What followed was a sequence of acts that, to the Vikings, ensured the chieftain's dominance would continue beyond the grave, but to modern eyes revealed a society where sexuality was wielded like an axe, blunt, brutal, and unflinching. To understand why such acts were not only tolerated but celebrated, you must first grasp the Viking worldview. In their culture, the roles taken during intimacy were not private matters, they were public statements of power. The active partner, the one who penetrated, was seen as strong, honorable, masculine. The passive partner, especially a man in that role, was forever marked as weak, dishonored, even stripped of his rights. In this system, the bedroom and the battlefield were governed by the same rule: dominate or be dominated. This obsession with dominance was codified in law. To be called arger or ragger, to be accused of sexual passivity, was an insult so grave that Viking law allowed you to kill the accuser without fear of punishment. This was not mere bravado. Such an accusation could cost you your property, your weapons, even your standing in the community. In some cases, it was said to be worse than death itself. Imagine living in a world where a whispered rumor about your performance in bed could strip you of your citizenship. The sagas parted history. Part legend preserved the stories of men who traveled hundreds of miles to kill someone for questioning their masculinity. A single insult could spark a blood feud that consumed entire families. The saga of Burnt Njal describes conflicts where dozens were slain over such slurs. In Egil's saga, warriors risked everything to avenge words spoken in jest. In Viking society, the wound to a man's reputation could fester deeper than any blade. Women, too, wielded this dangerous weapon of words. In the Laxdæla saga, a wife publicly shamed her husband by questioning his virility, ensuring his fall from honor. In another tale, a woman divorced her spouse because he was too gentle in bed, a statement that not only humiliated him, but ruined his social standing forever. These were not idle comments. They were daggers aimed at the very core of a man's identity. But the Vikings did not rely solely on words to enforce their sexual hierarchy. They used acts of symbolic violence, and sometimes very real violence, to mark their enemies as conquered in the most degrading way possible. One such act was known as the shame stroke, a deliberate wound to the buttocks of a defeated foe, symbolizing forced submission. This was more than physical injury. It was the theft of a man's honor in front of all who witnessed it. And sometimes symbolism was not enough. The sagas describe instances where captured kings and warriors were publicly raped their masculine essence as the Vikings saw it transferred to the victor. In their belief system, forcing someone into the passive role literally made you stronger while destroying them completely. A man so violated could never return to his people with honor intact. Many chose suicide rather than live marked forever by such shame. From these acts emerged an unspoken rule. In the Viking world, the ultimate victory was not just to kill your enemy, but to break them so completely that their own people rejected them. And so, sexual violence became not an act of impulse, but a deliberate, calculated weapon of war. It was a tool of psychological destruction, one that could make entire communities surrender without a fight, knowing the fate that awaited them if they resisted. This was only the beginning of the darkness Ibn Fadlan recorded, and the depths yet to come would test the limits of what any human mind could comprehend. The power of this system lay in its efficiency. By making sexual humiliation a fate worse than death, the Vikings ensured their enemies would fear capture more than battle itself. A swift death on the battlefield might be honorable, but returning home stripped of manhood, mocked and shunned, was a living death. Leaders of rival tribes knew this, and many surrendered without a fight when Viking sails appeared on the horizon, hoping to spare their people a fate that no sword could block. But humiliation was only one side of the Viking sexual code. There was also an economy, a vast and thriving market in human beings, many of whom were destined for intimate exploitation. Dublin, York, Hedeby. These were not just trading hubs for goods and silver, but for flesh. Archaeological digs in Dublin suggest that nearly a third of the city's population at its height were slaves, many captured in raids specifically for sexual use. For Viking chieftains, the most beautiful captives were kept as part of private collections, a living display of wealth and dominance. The sagas speak of Earl Sigurd of Orkney, who maintained a harem of captured Irish women. They were passed among his men like fine wine, valued not as people but as trophies. The law offered them no protection. A free woman's virtue was guarded by harsh penalties. Rape of a freeborn woman could mean death, but the rape of a slave that was treated like damaging property, punishable only by a fine. The message was clear in Viking society. Your status determined whether your body was sacred or disposable. The sheer scale of this practice was staggering. Ships returned from raids not only laden with gold and weapons, but with human cargo men, women, and children destined for markets where they would be prodded, priced, and sold. The most attractive women were set aside for chiefs and war leaders, their beauty both a pleasure and a political asset. Those less favored were sold into brothels or sent as gifts to secure alliances. Each transaction reduced a human life to a bargaining chip in the great game of power. And yet, for all their brutality, the Vikings wrapped their most intimate rituals in the trappings of religion and tradition. Nowhere was this more grotesquely evident than in their wedding ceremonies. To modern eyes, a wedding is a private celebration of love. To the Vikings, it was a public transaction, one that had to be witnessed, verified, and in the most literal sense, consummated before the eyes of the community. On the wedding day, the bride's family gathered to watch the couple exchange vows, and then to watch something far more invasive. It was customary for members of both families to remain nearby, sometimes in the very room, to ensure that penetration had occurred. Without such witnesses, the marriage could be declared invalid, and the bride's family could demand the dowry back. This was not romance. It was contract law enforced through physical proof. The ceremony itself was steeped in sexual symbolism. Thor's hammer Mjolnir was placed on the bride's lap, a fertility blessing that everyone knew carried an explicit phallic meaning. The hammer would be blessed by the priest, and passed around for guests to touch, creating a communal ritual that blurred the lines between religion and eroticism. The groom's removal of the bridal crown was another public signal virginity was about to be claimed, and everyone present understood its meaning. Even after the vows, privacy was limited. The couple would be escorted to the marriage bed blessed with fertility prayers that often veered into explicit language. Relatives would wait outside, listening for the sounds that confirmed the act was complete. The next morning, the bed sheets, ideally blood-stained, would be displayed as proof of the bride's virginity. These sheets were sometimes preserved for years, ready to be produced in court if the marriage was later contested. In some cases, the intrusion went even further. Trusted family members, often older male relatives, would remain in the room during consummation to provide eyewitness testimony. The sagas record instances where an uncle or elder literally stood watch to ensure the act was properly carried out. To us, it is a grotesque violation of intimacy. To them, it was a safeguard of property rights and bloodlines. This legalistic approach to intimacy stripped marriage of any pretense of romance. Love was irrelevant. What mattered was ensuring that inheritance flowed correctly, alliances were secured, and no one was cheated in the exchange. The bride and groom were players in a transaction that revolved around fertility, honor, and wealth. And yet, as shocking as Viking weddings were, they paled in comparison to the rituals of death, where intimacy became the final terrible offering to the gods. When a chieftain died, the village did not simply mourn. It prepared a performance of belief and authority. Ibn Fadlan recorded how the elders asked the enslaved women who will go with him, and one volunteered, convinced she would accompany her master into the next world. From that moment, she was set apart, dressed and attended like a living relic, while the community moved around her with the grim efficiency of people who thought they were doing something holy. In the days that followed, the woman was led through tightly choreographed rites meant to charge her passage with communal strength. Ritual drinking blessings from elders whispered messages to deliver to the dead. Men approached her, not as individuals seeking pleasure, but as participants in a ceremony they believed would transfer vitality to their fallen leader. Each told her to carry a message of loyalty into the afterlife, as if words and breath could travel across the fire. On the final day, she was brought to a pavilion beside the funeral ship where an older woman, whom Ibn Fadlan calls the Angel of Death, guided the last dreadful steps with practiced command. The attendants lifted the volunteer onto the platform, the cords were drawn, and the ritual reached its end with a swiftness that suggested long familiarity. The point was not cruelty for its own sake, the Vikings would have said, but passage, certainty, order. Then the ship was readied, offerings piled high, the dead chieftain sat beside the woman prepared to follow him. Torches found the pitch, the wood answered with a roar, and the tribe's chants rose to meet the sky. From the shore, flames turned faces into masks, and the smoke seemed to write a verdict neither the living nor the dead could contest. To an outsider, it was horror. To those on the beach, it was proof that power outlived the body. But archaeology would later ask a harder question: how much of this spectacle was isolated and how much was a pattern? Across Scandinavia, high-status burials have yielded suggestive echoes of the account ship graves with multiple body signs of violent ends, arrangements that imply ritual over accident. The famous Oseberg ship burial in Norway, with 2 women interred amid riches and ceremony, has fueled debate for decades. Other sites reveal young female remains placed with elite men, making scholars weigh legend against soil-stubborn facts. The agreement is not perfect, but the pattern is hard to ignore. Death rites that bound sexuality, status, and sacrifice into a single story about power. To the Viking mind, none of this was random. The idea that life force could be channeled through words, touch, or closely guarded rites made the community complicit in sustaining a leader's authority beyond his final breath. In that logic, the woman chosen to die was no longer a person with a future. She became a vessel, a bridge, a reassurance that hierarchy could outlast the grave. The terror for us lies in how seamless the transformation appears. The ritual turns violence into virtue and participation into piety. The same culture that sanctified such rites drew a sharp, deliberate line between the freedoms of the freeborn and the absolute vulnerability of the enslaved. Free women could own property, request divorce for failure of duty or dishonor, and negotiate alliances through marriage. Enslaved women had no legal standing at all, and yet the saga world also shows free women urging vengeance, shaming men who failed to act, and sometimes abetting the very systems that kept other women in chains, a harsh arithmetic of survival inside a brutal hierarchy. Beneath these public codes lay private arithmetic. As well, families sometimes exposed unwanted infant girls, a quiet culling that narrowed futures before they began. The result was a society where a smaller cohort of free women could wield real leverage, while an underclass disproportionately female bore the weight of exploitation. In this tension, rights at the summit, ruin at the base, the Viking world sharpened its contradictions until they cut. The rules for men were equally unforgiving, though carved on different stone. Same-sex relations did not automatically condemn a man. What mattered was role and reputation. A man who kept the active posture could still claim honor, while the passive role marked him as unfit for citizenship. Even the gods were not spared this scrutiny. Loki's shape-shifting and Odin's practice of satyr magic associated with women became fodder for accusations of unmanliness. In the poems, proof that anxiety over status ran from mortals to myths. Law codes punished not the desire, but the insult, the word that could unmake a man's place in the hall. Justice itself was staged like theater, with punishments designed to mirror the crime, in humiliating ways, turning the town square into a lesson written on living bodies. Sagas remember festivals where captives were paraded for sport, and penalties doubled as public warnings. Excavations at execution grounds show careful choreography rather than impulse. Whether every detail is literal or a storyteller's cold embroidery, the direction is consistent. Sex power and violence were braided into a single rope, and the tighter it was pulled, the easier whole communities bent to it. Ready for more. In the next 10 sections, we'll descend into how weddings, courts, and marketplaces fused into one machinery of dominance, and how its echoes still travel our world today. In Viking marketplaces, the fusion of commerce and conquest was on full display. Traders haggled over silver arm rings and amber beads within sight of chained captives, their value assessed with the same appraising glances. A fine sword might fetch a pouch of silver. A healthy, attractive slave could command far more. The air was thick with the smell of tarred, rope-salted fish, and the human sweat of those who knew they were merchandise. Here, economic power rested not just on goods, but on the commodification of bodies. Dublin was perhaps the clearest example, a bustling hub where archaeology suggests that 1 in 3 inhabitants was enslaved. These were not anonymous laborers. Records and sagas tell of captives taken for specific purposes, with beauty or skill dictating their price. Political alliances could be sealed with the gift of a human being, an unspoken reminder that every treaty was backed by the threat of future raids and future captives. The trade routes carried not just furs and iron, but stories of what awaited those who resisted. For the Vikings, the psychological impact of these stories was as valuable as the slaves themselves. Tales of public humiliation, ritual violation, and legal impunity spread faster than any ship, softening the resolve of distant communities long before the dragon-prowed bows appeared. If resistance meant not just defeat, but degradation, surrender became a form of survival. Fear was a currency, and they spent it lavishly. The same blend of spectacle and control governed their legal system. A court was not simply a gathering to decide disputes, it was a performance that reinforced the hierarchy. Insults, especially those touching on sexual honor, were not handled in backrooms. They were aired before an audience, verdicts delivered with the kind of public drama that left reputations either shored up or shattered. A man cleared of such an insult left vindicated. A man condemned left as a marked figure, his standing eroded in the eyes of all. In some cases, punishments mirrored the crime in chilling symmetry. A convicted rapist might be subjected to public violation before execution, the crowd watching as justice took on the form of the original offense. Adulterers could be castrated before jeering onlookers. These were not merely sentences, they were warnings carved into communal memory, ensuring the same breach would be feared by others. Festivals, too, became occasions for such grim entertainments. Sagas recall contests in which prisoners were subjected to staged humiliations, each round more elaborate and degrading than the last. Bets were placed on how long they could endure. The cruelty was not hidden. It was integrated into the rhythm of the celebration, as familiar to the participants as the music and the mead. Violence in this context was not an aberration, it was part of the expected spectacle. The archaeological record lends credence to these tales. At certain execution sites remains bear marks not just of killing, but of deliberate mutilation, consistent with ritual humiliation. Patterns of wounds, placement of bodies, and accompanying objects suggest that these were not haphazard acts of rage, but premeditated displays meant to convey a message. Power decides not only life and death, but the manner of both. By normalizing such acts in peacetime, the Vikings ensured they could commit them in war without hesitation. The boundary between justice and conquest blurred, each reinforcing the other. A leader who could stage such dominance at home would face little resistance abroad. The home audience, conditioned by spectacle, accepted similar treatment of foreign enemies as both just and glorious. This conditioning extended into the private sphere. A household was expected to reflect the same order as the hall or the marketplace, the master dominant, the dependents obedient. Even intimate relationships were mapped onto this hierarchy, with clear consequences for those who stepped outside their prescribed role. The stability of the Viking world, such as it was, depended on everyone knowing their place and the penalties for forgetting it. And yet, woven through this tapestry of control, there were moments of paradox where the same system that oppressed could also empower. Free women who mastered its rules could maneuver for advantage, arrange marriages to consolidate power, or wield insult as a weapon sharper than steel. Men who navigated its codes with skill could rise from obscurity to honor. But these were exceptions that proved the rule in the Viking order. Power was inseparable from dominance, and dominance was inseparable from the readiness to use another person's body as a battleground. By the late Viking Age, these patterns were deeply ingrained, passed down as much through example as through law. A boy grew up watching disputes settled with words that could kill women's reputations, elevated or destroyed in a single feast night challenge, and leaders who proved their worth as much by public displays of dominance as by victories at sea. To survive was to internalize the code, strength in all its forms must be performed. This performance extended to religion. The sagas are thick with moments where gods themselves become embroiled in the politics of gender and sexuality. Loki's shapeshifting into female forms, Odin's practice of cedar magic linked to women were tales retold with a mix of admiration and suspicion. These divine stories mirrored mortal anxieties. Even the most powerful could be accused, and even accusations without proof could leave a stain. Legal texts show how seriously such stains were taken. False accusations of sexual passivity were punished with the same severity as murder, a sign of how deeply reputation was tied to identity. The insult itself was a weapon capable of destroying alliances, prompting duels, or triggering feuds that bled into the next generation. The pen was not mightier than the sword in the Viking world, it was merely another blade. If the code was harsh, it was also adaptable. Men who returned from distant raids brought with them not only treasure but foreign lovers, customs, and rumors. Some blended into the existing framework. Others were twisted to fit, stripped of their original meaning. The result was a culture that could absorb new forms of dominance without ever loosening its grip on the old. The tension between openness to novelty and rigid enforcement of hierarchy kept Viking society in a state of constant testing. A new god could be honored if he respected the order. A new ally could be welcomed if he knew his place. And a new practice could be adopted if it reinforced rather than threatened the structures that kept power concentrated in the hands of the few. Even the sea which shaped their world was part of this system. Raids were not random bursts of violence, but planned operations with specific goals, wealth, slaves, and stories. The stories mattered most. They magnified the fear of the Vikings far beyond their actual reach. A single raid could echo for decades, each retelling growing darker, until the mere rumor of their approach was enough to break resistance. This weaponized reputation was perhaps their most enduring creation. Long after the sails stopped appearing on the horizon, the idea of the Vikings as invincible, merciless, and willing to take whatever they desired continued to serve as both warning and inspiration. In some corners of medieval Europe, their absence was met with relief. In others, with a strange kind of longing for the certainty their dominance had provided. For the Vikings themselves, the measure of a life well lived was not comfort, but legacy. Legacy was carved into runestones, sung in halls, and etched in the bones of those buried with them. It was preserved in the sagas, where even the most brutal acts were given a narrative arc that made them part of something larger. Honor was not about morality, it was about memory. But memory is a dangerous thing. It can glorify what should be condemned and smooth the edges of horror until they look like tradition. The Viking legacy, shaped by their own storytellers and later by others, often omits the small human costs, the nameless slaves, the silenced victims, the communities that vanished without a trace. To see the whole picture, one must read between the lines of the sagas and listen for the voices left out. In the end, the true power of the Vikings lay not only in their ships or their swords, but in their ability to make others live within their story. That story dictated who could speak, who could act, and who could exist with dignity. It was a story where sex violence and status were threads in the same rope, and where to loosen one was to risk unraveling the whole. To understand them is to confront the uncomfortable truth that domination, once normalized, can feel like order to those who benefit from it. The final phase of our journey through this world begins, as it must, with fire. Fire was the Vikings' most visible signature. Villages on the coast saw it on the horizon and knew what it meant. But fire also burned in their rituals, their halls, and their imaginations. It was the light that sanctified a wedding bed, the pyre that sent a chieftain to Valhalla, the glow that made dominance visible to all who watched. In the flicker of that light, boundaries dissolved. A slave could be dressed as a bride, a battlefield could turn into a courtroom, and an execution ground could double as a festival stage. The same audience might witness a victory feast one month and a humiliation spectacle the next, each reinforcing the same unspoken lesson. Every place was a place of judgment. Such omnipresent scrutiny made life a constant performance. A misstep in private could be punished in public. A man who faltered in the bedchamber could lose property or standing. A woman whose behavior suggested disloyalty could be cast out or worse. These were not idle threats, they were backed by precedent remembered in story and enforced by law. The sagas, while often romanticized, do not flinch from these realities. They give us glimpses of laughter at another's downfall, of insults turned into vendettas, of women wielding mockery as deftly as men swung swords. Each tale is a reminder that power was contested not only on the prow of a longship, but also across the benches of a mead hall. By binding intimacy to law and honor, the Vikings made personal life a political matter. Marriage could seal alliances, divorce could fracture them, and accusations of sexual inadequacy could ignite conflicts as bloody as any raid. No realm of existence, love, loyalty, faith was free from the logic of dominance. Even the concept of the afterlife was entangled in this logic. Valhalla was not merely a paradise for the brave. It was an extension of the same hierarchies. The chieftain entered it with his spoils, and if custom allowed, with a human companion taken through ritual sacrifice. The slave girl's death was thus not an end, but a continuation of service sanctioned by the collective will of her captors. For the community, participating in such a ritual was not a moment of horror, but of affirmation. They were ensuring that the dead would remain powerful, and that they themselves would be part of that enduring strength. In their eyes, it was not cruelty, but necessity, not exploitation, but tradition. Modern sensibilities recoil from such reasoning, yet it is this gap between past and present that makes the Viking story so potent. We see their acts as atrocities, they saw them as acts of order. That tension between their self-image and our judgment is where the deepest unease lies. It is tempting to imagine that such extremes belong only to distant centuries. But the mechanisms using fear to control, turning bodies into symbols, wrapping dominance in ritual, are not relics. They reappear in new forms, in new languages, wherever power seeks permanence. The Vikings understood that the most enduring conquests happen not on the battlefield, but in the mind. If they could make their victims their rivals, and even their own people accept a certain order as natural, then their power would survive beyond their lifetimes. And in that sense, long after the sails vanished from the seas, the Viking way of binding sex violence and status into a single, unbreakable cord still casts its shadow. In the quiet, after the fires burned out and the sails disappeared over the horizon, the survivors of Viking raids were left to rebuild not only their homes, but their sense of self. Villages carried scars both visible and invisible, knowing their story had been rewritten by those who had come and gone. The absence of the raiders did not erase the imprint of their order. It lingered in law codes and whispered warnings in the cautionary tales told to children. Some of those children grew into chroniclers, monks and poets who recorded the Viking Age in ink and memory. Their accounts, whether hostile or grudgingly admiring, preserved the dual image of the Norsemen as both fearsome warriors and cunning architects of dominance. Through their words, the Vikings shaped how the world would remember them, not merely as plunderers but as masters of a cultural weapon that outlived their empire. Archaeologists, centuries later, would dig into burial mounds, harbor mud, and ruined halls, finding artifacts that confirmed as much as they contradicted the sagas. A hammered coin from Dublin slave markets. A bridal crown buried with a woman who might never have worn it in peace. Bones scored in ways that spoke of more than simple execution. Each discovery was another verse in a song that had never truly ended. The modern fascination with Vikings often strips away these harsher truths. Popular images favor the freedom of the seas, the thrill of discovery, the romance of exploration. But beneath the horned helmet myths lies a reality of calculated terror, where intimacy was a tool, humiliation a strategy and ritual, a cloak for the most brutal acts imaginable. To understand them fully is to hold both images in mind, the skilled shipwright shaping a keel to cut across oceans, and the warlord shaping a law to cut down an enemy's honor. The same hands that carved intricate patterns into wood could also bind a slave for sale. The same voice that recited poetry could order an execution staged for maximum humiliation. The endurance of their legacy lies in how well they wove these contradictions into a single fabric. It was a culture that could be both deeply artistic and relentlessly violent, where the pursuit of beauty coexisted with the machinery of dominance. For the Vikings, there was no paradox, only different expressions of the same will to power. Today, we read their sagas, study their ruins, and reconstruct their ships, not just to learn about the past, but to see our own reflection in it. The tools may have changed, the rituals evolved, but the underlying impulses to control, to display, to make power visible remain part of the human story. The Viking world reminds us that atrocities do not have to hide in shadows to endure. They can thrive in the open, woven into celebration, law, and faith. The most dangerous systems are those that persuade their subjects to see domination as tradition and tradition as virtue. This is the shadow that stretches from the halls of long-dead chieftains to our present day, a lesson about how easily cruelty can be normalized when it wears the mask of order. To confront it is to resist the comforting half-truths that make history palatable. It is to look squarely at the human capacity for building worlds where violence is not an aberration but the foundation. And so the story of the Vikings in all its brilliance and brutality closes as it began with a question. Not about their ships or their battles, but about us. When power demands that we accept its terms, will we recognize the cost before it is too late? That is the real inheritance of the Northmen, not their treasures, not their sails, but the warning that conquest begins where conscience ends.